Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Archaeology Institute afternoon seminar. I'm Christopher G, and I work for the Institute of Archaeology in Orkney. And I'm going to introduce Professor Vicki Cummings today, who's going to be our speaker. Vicki is Professor of Neolithic Archaeology, the Deputy Head of Research at School of Natural Sciences at the University of Central Lancashire. She's a regular in Orkney during the summer months, or at least has been over the last few years anyway, and I've worked with her on a few sites. She's got a particular interest in the Neolithic of Britain and Ireland, particularly in their European context, also in monumentality, particularly tombs and dolmens, and has just written and published, I think it's published now, or if not very soon to be, a book on dolmens of the British Isles. And also she's interested in the Neolithic settlement sites of Orkney and has excavated recently at Katasand in Sanday, just along from the site that she'll be talking about today, and also at Smerkoi, just outside Kirkwall, both early Neolithic sites. The title of today's talk is Recent Excavations at the Neolithic and Bronze Age Monument at Tresness and Sanday. And I'm not going to say much more other than the meeting's being recorded, so if you don't want to be seen on camera, turn off your camera or drape a bit of linen or silk or whatever over it. And if you've got any questions, you can ask questions as the talk's going on. Type your questions into the chat box and address them to everyone. You'll see there's a drop-down list. Put them to everyone. So, Vicki, Professor Vicki Cummings, over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris. So I'm now going to share my screen and my PowerPoint. I hope this works. And if it doesn't, please give me a shout. And I'm going to assume it's all working fine as I move forward, but do give me a shout if the slides stick or anything like that as I'm going along. So thanks ever so much for the invite today. I'm delighted to be talking to you and UHI, having been working closely, as Chris said, with a number of colleagues at UHI for many years. And I'm going to be talking to you today about the excavations at Tresness, which we've been doing for a few years now. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about the excavations results from 2019 and 2021. And we missed 2020 for obvious reasons. And this is very much a joint project between myself and Hugo Anderson-Weymark at the National Museum in Edinburgh. And the earlier seasons were also run collaboratively with UHI as well. So it is a collaborative, very much a collaborative project. So before I run through the results of our excavations, and I should say these are very preliminary results, we only finished excavating in September of this year. So we've still got, well, we're still writing the data structure report even, and we certainly haven't got any of the analyses done, so they are very, very much preliminary results. I just want to place this research into a little bit of a wider research background to explain really why we've been doing this research in the first place. And the first thing, which will be very familiar to colleagues up in UHI, is that we now have a much better understanding of domestic architecture in the Orkney Islands. And this is published in this wonderful book edited by Colin and Richard Jones. And really the sort of extended investigations of settlements in Orkney has really produced almost unprecedented levels of detail and understanding of the domestic sort of setup in both the early and the late Neolithic of Orkney. And as Chris mentioned earlier, I was very lucky to work with both Colin and Chris and Jane at the site of Smerkoi, a really good example of some of this wonderful, well-preserved domestic architecture in Orkney. So we've now got a really good understanding, I think, of the sort of domestic setting and the domestic life of people in the Orkney Islands and throughout the Neolithic. On top of that, there has also been some recent work on the dating and sequences of chambered tombs. This again was published in this book. This is the work of Sarah Griffiths. And really this was very useful in showing us the kind of dating as far as we know, of these chamber tombs, but it also really highlighted, I think, the fact that more work needs to be done. This was a big step forward, but we certainly need more excavations, more up-to-date excavations, good stratigraphic sequences in order to really begin to take what we know now about the chamber tombs and come up with a much better understanding of sequence and chronology. So clearly some new excavations were very much in order, I think, for furthering our understanding of the chamber tomb sequence, particularly since our understanding of the domestic architecture has come so far so quickly in the last couple of decades. This is also a very exciting period in terms of other scientific developments, and I've been very lucky to be involved in a project on ancient DNA. This is coming out next month in Nature, and this is really the results of the genetic analyses of a single set of human remains from Hazelton North in this instance. But what we're finding is really unprecedented level of details from the ancient DNA. So this is on top of that broader understanding that we now have of the movements of people at the start and for the spread of the Neolithic and probably throughout the Neolithic. But in this instance, we've also got biological relatedness from the individuals that were buried at Hazelton North. And in this instance, the first generation of people is represented by the adult who's in there in black. And that male actually had offspring with 4 different women, and those many of those offspring turn up in generation 2, and as you can see, their offspring turn up in subsequent generations in this particular monument. So this is really fantastic detailed genetic evidence which we've taken to interpret kinship from this. Of course, this actually relates to biological relatedness, the fact that these individuals are biologically related to one another, but we're inferring from this that there was an understanding of kinship and that chamber tombs were therefore very much about kin relations and about people being buried in these monuments. And of course, we've long suspected this in relation to chamber tombs, but this is the first genetic evidence which actually demonstrates that. And as I say, that'll be out next month. And it was against this background of different things, a better understanding of the domestic architecture, I think the need for new excavations to improve our chronological understanding and the potential of things like the ancient DNA that led us to go and think about looking for a chambered tomb to actually excavate to try and to further our understanding of the Orcadian sequence. And the monument that you'll know we've chosen is Tresness on the Isle of Sanday. And this was chosen really because it is a monument that is very much under threat. And on the left, the image there, these were images taken for Historic Environment Scotland in the early 80s. And the image on the right is how we left the monument in 2019. And the arrow indicates how much has actually been lost in quite a short period of time. In fact, when we first went out and visited this site, you could walk out from where the chamber, you can see the chamber in the image to the right, you could actually walk out along that little shelf and look up at the stratigraphy. By the time we got back there in 2019, that entire shelf had gone, and I've indicated that with the blue arrow. So this is a monument that is in a very precarious position. It's on the southern tip of the Tresness Peninsula, and it is literally disappearing into the sea. So we estimate that about 2 meters has been lost since it was first explored in the early 1980s. So I think there's there was certainly a good rationale in our minds for excavating and choosing this particular site to have a look at in more detail. Again, just to sort of show that on the left is the excavations, small-scale excavations by Beverly Smith in the early 80s. And actually this is cell or compartment 5 at the end. And when she revealed this particular area, actually most of the chamber deposits were still in place by the time we got back and started excavating the site in 2019. And you can see from the photogrammetry on the right, actually all of those deposits had disappeared. So this really was a monument that was significantly being deteriorated quite rapidly. Now, while we were walking out to visit Tresness to see about whether or not we should excavate this particular site, we came across another site, which Chris mentioned in the introduction, which is Katasand. And again, I was involved in the excavation of this with Colin Richards, Jane Downs and Chris. And this is a very short distance away. I'll show you a map in a moment from Tresness. As I say, we discovered it walking out to Tresness. And this is an early Neolithic structure, multiple halves suggesting multiple occupations at this particular location. And again, you can see that this again is a site that's very much at risk. In fact, the half of it was in the intertidal zone, and the image on the left is the site at a very high tide. We think that the site had been preserved by the little dune that you can see. I think actually is Chris standing on top of that little dune on the left. When we went back this year, most of that dune is now actually gone. It's much smaller, and I suspect that the dune will disappear completely. And that was very much preserving the archaeology underneath it. So again, this is a very dynamic landscape. And so we were lucky and I think very fortunate to be able to excavate this site before it was lost forever. I'm not going to talk about Katasand though, but it is important just to note how close the two sites are. So I'm not sure if you can see my my arrow, but that is the little dune just to the below 40 on Katasand. That's the location of the settlement at Katasand. And we've been working down on this Tresness Peninsula, right at the very southern tip, at the chambered tomb that's marked on the OS map there. And just to put it into context, I also just want to highlight that this is very close to Coyness, which is a very well-known site excavated by Gordon Child, which is on the next peninsula over to the west. And this is actually a really, I mean, it's a fantastic landscape, very lucky to have been working in this particular location. But it's also a very rich landscape. The Tresness Peninsula, the Tresness farmstead, just by 39. This area once supported multiple families, to give you an indication of how good this agricultural land was. And the break that has now created at the clog through to create what's now Katasand, that was created in the 19th century. So the Tresness Peninsula would be attached towards Overbister. So you can see that this is literally connected, and then there's the next peninsula over with Coyness. So it's a really good landscape, really rich agricultural landscape, very sandy, so very good for keeping animals such as cattle. So this is the sort of the broader context of why we were working at Tresness, and I'm now going to sort of talk you through really what our preliminary results. It was first identified and planned really by Audrey Henschel. She, as always, did a wonderful job of interpreting what she found on the ground. She identified this as the remains of a stalled cairn of some description, and her suggestion, as you can see from her plan, is that the stalled cairn was then superimposed with a later round mound. And she also identified this later walling, and that's the walling that was identified and excavated by Beverly Smith in the 1980s, and that's now lost. None of that currently survives, and in fact a lot of the edge that Audrey Henschel has here is also disappeared, as I mentioned earlier. So one of our other research aims, on top of everything else, was really to see and to try and classify what kind of monument this was. Was it a stalled cairn, as Audrey Henschel had suggested? Was this what was the nature of this later round mound on top? So that was very much our research questions, and really the only bit of Tresness that was really visible to any extent was the little bit that's just to the north of the later walling on the plan, and you can see that there's this sort of slabs overlying what are clearly two orthostats, but the orthostats looked fairly smashed, and some walling here. So it was quite hard to really sort of make out what was going on the ground. It wasn't immediately clear what we were looking at. So I don't think any of us envisaged that this was what was preserved at Tresness when we first walked out there. I think it was a wet and windy December to visit Tresness for the first time. We found an exceptionally well preserved stalled cairn. The walls were virtually entirely intact, up to 1.6 metres high, particularly at the northern end. We had in fact found the remains of a rectangular stalled cairn, but as had been previously thought that the passage was down to the south that was effectively eroded over the cliff edge, this wasn't the case at all. What we actually had was a passage coming in from the east. So that was a completely new find. And we found the remains of 5 compartments or cells, 3 very typically sort of stalled cairn sized, a much larger 4th, and then what we're presuming was the 5th and final cell or compartment at the end. We'll never know for certain because, as we've seen, that's eroding into the sea. What we were also quite surprised about was the complexity of the deposits in the monument, and I'll talk about those in a moment. So I'm going to talk you through the results in the order of which that they were built. And one of our key questions really was there any pre-cairn activity? This is certainly something that you see a lot of in some of the other monumental sequences, well documented, particularly in Cotswold 7 monuments, for example. And the answer, quite simply, at Tresness was no. There was no identifiable pre-cairn activity in the areas that we looked for. And so we excavated, as you can see from the picture, the chambers, and we also excavated a section to the west. The areas we were looking at, there was no evidence of anything happening prior to the construction of the monument. And in fact, it appears that the monument was built directly on top of the ground surface. There was no burning, so it doesn't look like there was even very much vegetation clearance. It was just built directly onto the land surface. One of the other things we were very much interested in was the phasing of this monument, and I've illustrated that here, and this is really pulling on work from my current PhD student, Mike Lawler, who's looking at these interesting variations in alignments of chambers, and we'll also have a look at some other aspects of that in a moment. But you can see that this really on the ground, on the surface, looks very much like it could be the remains of a tripartite monument, of which I've illustrated an example on the left. And then this really noticeable change in alignment, about 10 degrees, and what looks very clearly to be a passage grave, looks like it's almost been sort of superimposed, potentially added on to this monument at a later date. And that was certainly our hypothesis as we began excavations this year. We'd seen this architectural arrangement, and we were thinking that this must be some kind of multi-phase monument, perhaps starting as a tripartite and then being added to. And again, you can see some kind of changes in orientation again with the passage there. We'd also noticed some interesting features when we were looking at the walling. So you can see the blue arrows are indicating again some breaks. And again, Mike Lawler has identified this at a number of stalled cairns in Orkney. And so we were very much thinking that this could be, again, evidence of phasing at this particular site with the addition of a passage grave on top of a stalled cairn. And again, just to sort of illustrate some of those changes, this is the passage this time. And you can see really clearly, actually, that between the first chunk of walling and the second chunk of walling, they haven't even tried to disguise the phases of this. There's a very clear difference in those two sections of walling. So it was almost like this was being emphasized in some parts of the monument. So this was really one of our clear objectives for this year. But when we came to look and investigate this through the architecture of the monument, we were led to conclude that this was actually constructed more or less as a unitary construction. And I apologise for the slightly wobbly red lines. This was done in PowerPoint. It was just to really show you that we were able to identify both the inner facing wall that essentially supports the chamber and the outer facing wall, which encloses the entire thing. There were no joins anywhere here. We were, I think, anticipating to see evidence of an earlier tripartite, but we didn't find this. We found that as far as we could see, and certainly in the areas we were looking at, this was constructed as a unitary thing, effectively. And really interesting in terms of thinking about how this monument was actually constructed, we've got really good evidence that they were essentially building the chambers, so putting in the upright orthostats and then filling in the dry stone walling around the edge. And then they were supporting that dry stone walling with some slabs that I'll show you here to keep everything in place. So it's, I'm not saying haphazard, but there was a lot of pressure being put on to keep everything in place to stop it sort of falling over. And you can see those big slabs here. So that's the inner face of the wall. And you can see these big slabs have been laid up against that to keep everything in place. So the walls of the chamber pushing out, those pushing in, and like a house of cards, keeping everything in place as they slowly constructed the chamber. When it came to the outer walling, however, they were much more haphazard. This wasn't particularly well constructed, much smaller stones you can see for the outer casing of the wall. And we think that the area to the left here is just simply some of that walling that's collapsed outwards because it really wasn't particularly well constructed. Clearly did the job, however, for quite a long period of time. So as far as we can tell, this is a unitary construction. We may have found a different story had we looked elsewhere, but in the area that we looked at, we do genuinely think that this was built in a single phase, albeit one that might have months, years, perhaps between different sections. Another thing we looked at was the infill, which we'll see in a moment, and we pulled out a lot of these lintel stones when we were excavating the chamber. They'd been added in later on, as we'll see. And another student, this is Leah Rawlinson's work when she was a UCLan student. She's since gone and done a master's at UHI. She measured all of the different lintel stones, and her suggestion was that if they were covered in this sort of arrangement that you can see here, there wasn't actually enough to cover the whole chamber. So again, that's quite interesting. Are we looking at two different styles of roofing at Tresness? Was the bit at the back covered with lintels? Were they perhaps more spread out? Were we looking at more traditional corbelling like we might see at something like Coines? So something's not entirely resolved through our excavations, but some very interesting work in terms of things like roofing, which of course very rarely survives in situ at monuments. So that's the architecture, that's the construction. I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about what we actually found in terms of use. And this is where things get much more complicated. We found many deposits throughout the chamber. We were quite surprised by the complexity of the different deposits. We're still working through, as I say, the data structure report, but we're thinking of 4 or 5 phases of use, good evidence of resurfacing and repaving particular areas. What was perhaps a little bit more surprising was that we found, as we'll see, lots of evidence of in-situ burning. And this is something that I guess we didn't particularly anticipate. And in fact, we're going to be arguing for in-situ hearths. We also found cremation deposits. And again, I think we were anticipating finding inhumations. We'll come to see that there were no inhumations at all, but this is a preservational issue. Even the cremation was very poorly preserved. And that's because the monument was built on top of quite heavy clay soils, and so even the cremation was quite squishy and smudgy by the time we got to it. So inhumations would not have preserved in this environment. And as we'll see, a really large number of stone tools and some particularly nice, special, shiny finds. And so I'm now just going to talk you through very briefly what we found in each of the different compartments or cells. And this isn't in chronological order, because as I say, we're still thinking about what happens in what order. Not much preserved in the top northern cell, apart from a lovely polished stone ball, which we found quite quickly and quite rapidly in the 2021 season. So that was a really lovely surprise for us. And I will talk more about these towards the end, because they are really quite amazing finds, really quite unusual. Otherwise, this cell contained very little in evidence, no bone, and very few other objects. Cell 2, so that's the next one down from the north, was much more interesting. For the most part, this was material that was found actually at the interface between cell 2 and cell 3, and I've indicated that with a blue arrow on the right hand side. And you can see the picture on the left. This is where the main cremation deposit came from. So it's directly placed, I think deliberately placed, between the two orthostats, dividing up cells 2 and 3. It was quite poorly preserved, but enough to identify at least some of the material was that of human remains, human cremation, sorry, as opposed to animal cremation. There may be a lot of it was not possible to say either way, whether it was a human or animal. Not much else in cell 2. The focus there was very much towards the bottom of cell 2 and the interface with cell 3. And this was where things again got quite interesting. So hopefully you can see to the north there, that is the cremation deposit. And then to the north of cell 3, we then found a number of ashy deposits. And we are actually thinking that this is in situ burning. It can't have been particularly hot because none of the stones of either the walling or the orthostats were burnt red, but we did find some of the stones in this area were red. So I'll come back to this and talk about this burning in a little bit more detail in a moment. But it was to our great surprise, I think, having uttered the words that it's a find of a lifetime and I'll never find another polished stone ball in all the days that I'm working, we promptly found another polished stone ball. And this was in the corner, in the southeast corner of cell 3. This one wasn't as well preserved. In fact, it laminated in situ. It was made from sandstone. So the top had pinged off when we were troweling the area and it came out in pieces. So it would have been an absolutely beautiful sandstone polished stone ball. You can, I hope, just make out some different colours on that sandstone. But it was a beautiful object, but just not as well preserved. So some lots and lots of really interesting finds from cell 3, some pottery as well, which I'll mention in a moment. It was really cell 4, which is the big chamber, that big sort of passage grave shaped chamber at Tresness, that was the most complicated. As I hope you can see from this image, lots and lots of burnt deposits mounded up in cell 4. Really complex stratigraphy, really difficult to unpick what was going on in this area. Multiple phases of burning, and clearly quite a lot of activity in this. Not surprisingly, here is the passage coming into the monument. So quite a lot of trampling events, things being differentially trampled depending where they were and whether they subsequently had a large slab placed over them. So the image on the right, you can see some really nice large slabs were placed later on in the sequence. Unfortunately for us, they preserved the archaeology and the stratigraphy in these areas really, really well. So just to sort of show you the state of some of that pottery, these are two of the fragments of pottery vessels we found in this area. You can see that they're really, really fragmentary, and this one on the left little fragments of this bowl were found both on top of and underneath this slab, so clearly crushed significantly in the Neolithic. And again, another real concentration of sherds at the passage chamber interface. So some really fantastic finds, just to sort of show you where they were turning up. We had the remains of at least 3 quite large bowls from Tresness, and I've indicated those, and of course the 2 polished stone balls. And it may well be, we haven't even started the pottery analysis yet, that we have many, many more vessels represented. We were, of course, anticipating lots of unstoneware, and in fact found very little unstoneware, but these are the main concentrations of the main vessels in the monument. On top of that, so those really nice finds, we also had 130 scale knives. Again, this isn't the scale knife collection from Tresness, this is another collection, but a typical find from Orkney. We did not anticipate 130 of these turning up at Tresness, a much smaller number, more typical number of flints. And the real disappointment was the lack of bone, which we are putting down to preservation. As you can gather from the beginning, we were really hopeful for well-preserved skeletal remains so that we could do some ancient DNA analyses on those. None of that survived at all. So that was the one thing that was a real disappointment, I suppose, about these excavations. The red circles are the main areas of burning in Tresness. So there's that interface between 2 and 3, and we saw that, and to the north of that was the cremation. But then again in 4, a really, really large fire in that particular area, and lots of other little fires as well. And we were actually thinking that they were actually burning in situ in sort of more or less little hearths. And this is an image from cell 3. And this is right on top of that burnt deposit. And those are stones that would be used quite typically in hearths of domestic structures. They're clearly not in situ there. I think they've probably been moved, but we're thinking that they were setting up almost like little domestic hearths in the monument and doing these little conflagrations within the actual chamber. So that's the use of it. I will come back and talk a little bit more about some of these aspects in a moment. Once they'd finished all of that at the end of its life, they filled it in almost to the top, we think. And this is an image taken from 2019, and you can see again one of those lintel stones has been taken off and pushed into the monument to backfill it and close it down from use effectively. However, as Audrey Henschel identified, there is a significant circular monument built on top, and this is good evidence for an early Bronze Age round cairn. That's just the image that you can see from the section that was visible before excavations began. And in fact, again, you can see the deterioration of this walling. Again, that had happened just as we were working there, this sort of whole aspect of the monument collapsing. And in 2019, we uncovered 2 elements of that walling. I hope you can see to the right with the grey stones. And we suggested that this was in fact the remains of a very significant early Bronze Age round cairn, and with a central kist in the middle of it. And indeed, we found really good evidence of that at the site. So this is the work we did this year to reveal this monument. I think we were amazed at how beautiful the early Bronze Age round cairn was. It really was very large. It was really beautifully built. The bit that was exposed on that southern section didn't do it justice. It really was a beautifully well constructed circular cairn. And there it is from Hugo's photogrammetry model. And you can see the beautifully well preserved outer walling. There it goes across the southern section. but we also found this inner wall to create the top, almost like a flattened dome on top of the monument, and that was the little bit of walling we found in 2019. So a really beautifully well preserved Bronze Age round cairn. The downside of this was that in order to build their round cairn, they really did quite a lot of damage to the earlier Neolithic monument. I hope you can see here, this is the sections through the chamber. They actually went in and they removed the third orthostats from the chambered tomb. They created these huge, great big cuts through the walling to haul out those orthostats, which they then bashed and smashed around to turn into the central kist, or utilise that in the central kist. So you can really see that that huge cut through the middle of the monument. And again, this just marks out where the walling was of that Bronze Age cairn. And then in the middle of the monument, on top of the first cell, quite high up, they put in a central kist. That had been very heavily robbed out before we excavated it. There was good evidence of antiquarian activity in there. This is the 2019 work, and we found some early Bronze Age remains identified in this instance with a solid radiocarbon date to show that date somewhere between 1900 and 1700 BC. So really fantastic evidence of early Bronze Age reuse in this particular at this particular site. And then, as I say, we've got good evidence then of them sort of covering that back up. And at a later stage, antiquarians clearly came in and they left the kist. They found the kist. They clearly altered and had a good rummage around through that, and then chucked everything back in, higgledy-piggledy. And that's what we identified, and that's why Audrey Henschel was able to identify that little hole at the top of the monument when she first surveyed the monument. So the antiquarians may well have found other things of which we don't have any record of that at the moment. So just to finish off this talk then, I'm going to try and sort of put these findings in some very preliminary wider context, bearing in mind we don't have any radiocarbon dates, none of the specialist analyses of any of the material culture. So these are just really some very preliminary thoughts that myself and Hugo have had. So first of all, in a wider context, Tresness is a unique monument. Its perhaps closest comparison would be Unston on mainland. This is Unston, and you can see in many ways it is very similar to Tresness. It has 5 cells like our monument at Tresness, with an eastern passage. And quite clearly here, it also has a side cell, which is very reminiscent of the better known passage grave traditions like Maes Howe or Coyness. It isn't quite the same, however, as our monument, because it is of course set within a round cairn, and ours clearly was within a much longer cairn. So similarities and differences, and I think this shows that architecturally people had quite a lot of flexibility when they were building. They were taking and drawing ideas, and I'm going to be talking about what this kind of combination of stalled cairn and passage grave might mean towards the end, because I think that's the really interesting thing at Tresness, and certainly I don't think what we were expecting to find. Those scale knives that we found throughout Tresness again were quite unusual, because they are found in large numbers in domestic contexts. We found lots at Katasand, and they are very much about I think about butchery and cutting, but in a chambered tomb context. We began to wonder whether this was actually about the processing or perhaps even the defleshing of human remains. Certainly don't think they were associated with domestic events within Tresness. And of course, from many chambered tombs, there is good evidence of human remains being defleshed. So this might be really good evidence of defleshing within Tresness, even if the bones that we would hope to demonstrate that haven't actually survived in this particular instance. We still don't know how many vessels we have from the monument. We may have many. They're predominantly represented by these much larger bowls, as you can see from these examples at Nap of Hower, and some, again, fairly similar examples from Poole also on Sanday. We were anticipating more of the little Unston bowls that you can see on the right-hand side. So that was quite a surprise, and I think we're going to find out quite a lot from the pottery analysis when we do that. For example, lipid analysis will be very, very instructive to see what people were actually doing in these pots. Had they been used for example, cooking? Could that also tie into the processing and defleshing of human remains? Lots of interesting questions of which we don't have an answer at the moment. The human remains, again, was a disappointment, but the presence of cremations was really, really fantastic. And as we're going to see, increasing evidence of, I think, links with the Irish passage tomb tradition. So that was a really pleasant surprise for us. And it was, of course, these wonderful polished stone balls that I mentioned that was, again, a really nice surprise for us. Not one, but two. And here are the top two are our examples from Tresness, just to show you that they aren't unique on Orkney. There are about 20 of these polished stone balls known from Orkney. I've just illustrated a few here for you. Again, this is from Hugo and Mark's work. But a really good parallel, I think, would be this example from Baccascale on Papawestray. And you can see that this choice of really distinctive stone in the Baccascale example, and also from one of our balls at Tresness. Some of the others are plainer. It's also interesting, I think, to note that when you look at the context of these polished stone balls, some of them, again, are found from domestic contexts. So Skara Brae and Rinyo, two well-known later Neolithic settlements on mainland and Rousey, have produced, again, beautiful polished stone balls. And again, the one from Skara Brae has these lovely incisions on it, sort of connecting the polished stone ball tradition with the carved stone ball tradition, which is perhaps better known throughout Scotland. And it was perhaps no surprise, but this was the aspect of these excavations that attracted considerable media attention. You may have seen bits and pieces in the media, things like the Smithsonian. Lots written about this, about these mysterious stone balls. My favourite example of this was one of the later pieces that came out, which they questioned why these mysterious stone orbs were stashed all over Neolithic Britain, and I thought that was a wonderful way of sort of trying to rephrase this sort of stone ball. But what this highlights really is the interest in these mysterious objects, but secondly, what these polished stone balls were actually all about, effectively. And they aren't known just from Orkney. They are, interestingly, also found in the Irish passage tomb tradition, and I've just illustrated a few here from Loch Crew, which is the image at the bottom. So passage graves, in this instance much larger passage graves in County Meath, but I think you can see the similarities with this sort of selection of a really beautiful and distinctive type of stone that's happened in order to create this wonderful polished stone ball. And interestingly, both large and smaller examples, and we did find, I haven't illustrated it here, but another smaller example of one of these. And so it's interesting that these polished stone balls, they did attract a lot of attention, but looking into them, they're things that are found now in tomb deposits on top of those known domestic deposits. And I guess the question really is, and this is, the question, why were people making these things? And this is something, again, that we're hoping to be able to explore now that we've got two wonderful examples from this site. The media very much went along with this idea of weapons and the idea of sort of, I suppose, bashing people on the head. And of course, there is evidence for interpersonal violence from the early Neolithic. It's well documented, human remains from chambered tombs. roughly 10% of them, certainly in the south of Britain, have evidence for interpersonal violence, and it's often a blow to the head, not exclusively. So I don't think we can rule this possibility out. It's certainly not my favourite interpretation of them. There's also very much a sort of a notion of symbols of power, that these were unusual things, therefore important people may well have owned these. They were perhaps sort of some sort of insignia. Again, I'm not completely against that idea. I do think it is interesting that they're selecting distinctive stones, and the two in Tresness are quite distinctive, beautiful stones that clearly were out of the ordinary. And for me, that's the more interesting aspect of those. And I can't help but wonder if these weren't much more tied up and associated with magic. And here I'm drawing on very much the work of people like Chris Gosden, who's talked about magic really being the underpinning interpretation of virtually everything in prehistory, when we don't have a modern understanding of the universe, of the world. Things could very easily be attributed to magic, things like illness. And I think that would be my favourite interpretation of how these things were used. And perhaps these were about all of these different things. It doesn't have to be one thing over the other. Finally, I just want to sort of show the broader context of Tresness. Nowadays, it's a fairly remote location, quite difficult to get to. But in this particular point of the Neolithic, it's actually in a really busy world. As we saw at the start, it's very close to Coinus. It's also the other passage grave on Sanday, the wonderfully called Mount Misery, is also visible from Tresness. So it sits between two other well-known Middle Neolithic monuments, or passage grave monuments, and it itself has wider views out across the world. We were very fortunate on a sunny day, we would be able to see right into the heart of Neolithic Orkney. You can see the hills of Hoy from Tresness, and you can also see Fair Isle and up in that direction. So it really was an area that felt very connected. And of course, Stronsay, just across the water, also looked very, very close to us when we were working there. And so really, I guess the question I'm going to leave you on this question is, why was this built? What else is going on at this time? You know, why is it that Tresness was built at this particular moment in time? We're thinking from the finds that we've got around about 3200 BC. Well, 3200 BC is a particularly exciting time in Neolithic Orkney. I've just put up some of the images of some of the things that were going on in Orkney at this particular time. So new type of pottery, new type of monuments. It's a pretty exciting and changeable time at this particular moment in time. And so we're wondering whether really Tresness is a reaction or a response to perhaps bigger changes going on, not just in Orkney, but in the wider Neolithic world. Upon which note, I will say thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and thanks to everybody who's contributed to this project. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Vicki. That was really interesting. And the thing that struck me most just looking at the pictures there that you had taken, is how similar the layout of the tomb is to the houses like Smerquai, particularly, and some of the other early Neolithic houses that would date from around about the same time. And also that there's so much going on in the tomb. I was really surprised when I got there to see all that burning and all the scale knives and everything. It's just, it was almost like it was a house.
Yes, it was a surprise to us as well, I think we can honestly say.
There's a few questions in the chat, and I'll just put them to you. There's Supreet was wondering, would the sea level rise affect the flint or any of the DNA found? If you were able to extract DNA, would it have been affected by sea level or sea?
No.
And I mean, like at Katasand too, potentially.
From Katasand. I mean, the sea levels have had a huge impact, obviously, on the survival of the monument. Fortunately, Tresness is about 5 meters above sea level now, so the contents of the chamber are well sealed, well preserved. So if we are able to get any aDNA, that should be very well preserved in terms of not having sea ingress into there, I would hope. However, will we get any ancient DNA? It seems increasingly unlikely now, unfortunately. It was one of our sort of key things I think we were hoping to be able to get from the monument. So you'll hear me sounding slightly disappointed sometimes that the stack of inhumations we were hoping for weren't there.
Thank you. And Sue Butler was wondering, is there any way to identify what was being burnt in the hearths?
Yes, there will be a way of identifying that. I don't have the answer for you at the moment. However, we have taken little samples, micromorphological samples through the hearths, and those have been sent off today actually for their made into little thin sections, and then a specialist is able to look at those in super detail, so in much more detail than we could see with the naked eye and certainly on the ground when we were excavating. And they'll be able to really unpick the different levels and different layers in those deposits, and potentially also say what was being burnt. You know, so we've also got the macrofossils. So these are the chunks of charcoal, perhaps seed. They may well be turning up as well. We've UHI has until very recently been filled with Tresness chamber samples that are currently being floated at the Orkney College, and again we'll get residues from that. We'll get large charcoals, smaller charcoal pieces. Again, we'll be able to get really good radiocarbon dates from those, be able to tell what species. So as I say, these are very preliminary results. We'll know an awful lot more in 2-3 years time when we've got the results of all these analyses back.
We look forward to that. Jerry Bigelow was asking, with regards to the sand, is the sand high carbonate shale content? I had a feeling it was quite silica rich, but do you know, Vicky? The sand that's around Katasand.
Pass on that one, sorry.
I seem to think it was fairly silica rich. I don't remember a terrible lot of shale in it, just from what I remember seeing at Katasand, right enough.
No, if the Katasand was certainly silica rich.
And Sue Taylor was asking if, I think it was in regards to the scale knives, if they could possibly have been from human defleshing.
Yes, I think that is sort of one of our sort of fairly grisly interpretations of what's going on. They're certainly quite coarse stone tools. We're just at the moment doing a preliminary analysis. One of the undergraduates at UCLAN's doing a preliminary analysis of the scale knives, and we've got good evidence of use of them. So they have been used. They're not just blanks that are being put in. So yes, I think one of our possibilities is that they were for defleshing human remains. Of course, there's also the possibility that they could have been processing animals in their rituals associated with human burials, and I don't think we can discount the possibility that they were for butchery of animals, but that would be perhaps more unusual. I think our favoured, if grisly, interpretation is that they're for defleshing human remains.
And Dave Lawrence wrote an interesting comment here, which I'll just read out if you don't mind. So far as I'm aware, this may be the first true case of Neolithic cremation in an Arcadian tomb. At Isbister, that's Tomb of the Eagles. However, there was evidence of burning above dry bone, and I wonder if that explains the relationship between the cremated bone and the burned area. Despite much recent DNA work, Hazelton North is the only example so far of a close relationship between the interred. Similarly, in Orkney tombs, there's several sites in England. I think that Queen has the only good skeletal evidence for body processing, so its nature remains somewhat unclear.
Yeah, this is I mean, the ancient DNA work is very much work in progress. There's lots of exciting things going on, lots of stories. Some of the other analyses that have been done haven't shown that kind of level of kinship. Bruner Boyne, for example, in Ireland, that's had some really detailed work, and again, people aren't related there. The interesting results, however, ancient DNA from the passage tombs from the Bruner Boyne, those have been interpreted well, the interpretation is that there were god kings, but there's certainly something very interesting going on in terms of the familial relationships there. So, you know, I think at the moment we've just got these kind of occasional examples, and it's very, very hard to draw parallels, certainly from somewhere like southern England all the way up to Orkney. But I think what it does show is that there is potential for understanding an awful lot more about who was being buried in these monuments. And it's not going to be the same. It clearly wasn't the same over the whole of Britain and Ireland, different things going on. So, you know, I think watch this space. Within a few years, there'll be much more work done, and we'll be able to say what was perhaps the dominant practice in Orkney. And I think that will be very, very interesting and add to this narrative.
Thank you. There's a few comments, people thanking you. It's an interesting talk. Joan Barrett asked, is there any information available on the links of Notland? There's an interim report, and I think the rest, is in the process of being written up, hopefully. Just going through the chat here. Thank you very much. Were Quanterness and Tresness in use at the same time, do you know? Andrew Fitches is asking.
Quanterness or coyness? Sorry, Chris.
It says Quanterness here.
Quanterness. Yes, potentially, I think. I mean, there's been huge amounts of work done on Quanterness, so reanalysis of Renfrew's original excavations, some fantastic work published in a variety of different locations, and Quanterness at the moment has very early radiocarbon dates. But I think certainly Quanterness and probably coyness are probably in use at the same time as Tresness. So yeah, really potentially overlapping.
Giles, so nice to see you here, Giles. Giles Carey's asking, did the stratigraphy of any of the hearths indicate multiple use or reuse?
Yes, absolutely. Really complex reuse of those particular locations, and particularly cell 4. So there was a really big dome deposit right as you came in, where the passage came into the chamber, and that was clearly reused over and over and over again. So yes, really quite complicated reuse of those areas, not one-off burning events.
Thank you. Yep, and it's people really just commenting and saying thanks very much, and that it would have been a bit of a grisly place if humans were being defleshed.
It most certainly would. Yeah, I think, I mean, another of the possibilities that myself and Hugo have talked about is that these fires were almost like cleansing fires. So that could have been one of the purposes of those fires. We don't think that the fires were either big enough or hot enough to have been actually where the cremations were taking place. So the hearths or the burning events may have been to sort of smoke out the chambers. That's again our working suggestion.
Thank you. Is there any estimate of the size of workforce required to construct the tomb?
It's one of those, people always tend to look for the sort of the least number of people that you would need, and I'm not sure that's always the point. I think it's probably more about the bringing together of people. None of the stones were gigantic. The biggest stones are the upstanding orthostats that create the different stalls throughout the chamber, and those, I think, I mean, I'm guessing 10 people could easily pull one of those into place. The rest were manageable by 2 or 3 people, even the big lintel stones. So it's perhaps more about how many people do you want to bring together to help construct this. I actually think you could probably, a good few people together could probably put this up fairly rapidly if they were so inclined.
Some strapping Sanday gents and ladies, maybe.
Yes, perhaps using some cows to help you out with the dragging of stones and so forth.
Yeah. I don't think I had any more questions here. It's just really comments and people saying thanks very much, and that's about 1 minute to 5. So I think I'll say thanks very much, Vicki. Thanks very much for coming and presenting that really interesting preliminary results to us. And we look forward to the final post-ex results at some point in the future.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me. It's nice to see everybody.
Thanks very much on behalf of us all. You can hear the clapping. And the video will be, the talk will be online. I think a couple of folk were asking. It'll be available at some point when I think Raggy or somebody manages to put it up. Yep. So good night, everyone, and thanks again, and thanks, Vicki.
Thank you, Vicki. Bye, everybody.
I've no idea who to end the meeting, Jane, do you know? Or Vicki?
Press the red cross, maybe?
Oh, yeah,
Oh,
that's it. Yeah.
that's
No, I
leave
think that's
event.
yeah, because Raggy had to go a pretty minute before it ended.
We could switch off recording.
Yeah. Do you know who to do that? I'm sure she's seen it.
Nice to see you both anyway.
Yeah, nice to see you, Vicki.
Yeah, thanks, Vicki. That's been grand, and we'll see what happens here in the spring. Field walking in bits and pieces.
Yeah, do get in touch. That would be great to come up, and yeah, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, grand.
And fantastic to see that, Vicki.
I mean, we never would have thought that was there, would we, when we first went up to Tresness that cold December day?
I know, it didn't look particularly promising, but that round cairn is absolutely astonishing.
Yeah, it's beautiful actually. We were quite, I'm going to be honest with you, we were quite sad to take it away to look at the Neolithic section. You know, it was beautiful. The walling on the outer wall was absolutely wonderful. It was really nicely constructed.
Beautifully done, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been really impressive. Actually, the Bronze Age cairn would have been almost more impressive than the Neolithic monument because it was so high, and you know,
It's the biggest one I know of.
is it?
No, apart from sorry, the Now's-a-Trotty big one. But it must be approaching the size of that, the diameter.
Yeah, so it was a well, I was surprised by how I sort of had an idea that, you know, the key thing was the kist in the middle and that the rest was just sort of, you know, put together. That's probably me not thinking about the Bronze Age. But it wasn't. It was so beautiful, and I wonder what it looks like. I mean, fortunately that bit will be very well preserved for hopefully a long period of time, but what it looks like around the north side, I bet it's almost immaculately preserved.
Oh, it would be fantastic, yeah. Oh, super. No, that was great. Really nice. Great talk.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and nice to see you, and hopefully I'll be up in Orkney soon.
Well, you can never leave because we don't know how to end this now.
No, I know. What do we do? If I press the big red cross, I'll disappear.
Yeah. I'm sure Raggy sorted it. Cheerio.
Bye.